What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today I'm going to be getting into a video that's a little bit different than the traditional videos I react to. Now, I've done wrestling-themed videos in the past. For those of you that aren't familiar, I think I've done maybe some WrestleManias. I could be wrong. I know I did the Jay Lethal Ric Flair promo confrontation, which to this day is probably one of the funniest things I've seen in like all the videos I've done reactions to. But today we're going to be getting into a video that is a little bit more, I can't really say serious, but it's not quite as comedic as that. This is a video related to stolen gimmicks. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar, gimmicks in wrestling are essentially the personas of wrestlers. Some people have go through like multiple different personas as their career goes on. Like when you think about guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who originally started his career as well, not started his career, but he was one of the Hollywood blondes with Brian Pillman, and then he came to the WWF and became the ringmaster. Well, he did some stuff before he came to the WWF, but when he came to the WWF, he was ringmaster. Then he eventually transitioned into Stone Cold Steve Austin. The Rock was what was his name when he first started wrestling? Like Flex Cabana or something like that. And then he came into the WWF, WWE now, and became Rocky Maivia. And then once he turned heel, he switched over and became The Rock. And from that moment on, everything was, history. Maybe one day I'll do a tier list of like my favorite wrestlers, because I think that would be interesting. I can already tell you, well, I'm not going to tell you who's on the top. You can probably already guess who I have at the top of like my favorite wrestler of all time. But you don't know who's behind that or the reasoning for why they're my favorite wrestler of all time. But anyway, let's jump into this and see wrestlers who had their gimmicks stolen by somebody else. And chances are I'm willing to bet that the person who like followed up with the gimmick probably was more successful. At least that's what I'm thinking. I could be wrong. But this video is made by a channel called Wrestle with Andy. I will have a link for their channel at the end of the video. The last 30 seconds, you'll see something pop up over here. You can click on it, check out their channel, look at their videos, all the other good stuff. And the original link for this specific video will be in the description box down below in case you want to watch it without my commentary on top of it. If you want to show the original content creator support, click on that link, hit the like button. If you're a content creator yourself looking to do a reaction or looking to put this into your video, then that'd be the link that you use. Anyway, let's jump into this.
There's a saying that goes, talent borrows, genius steals. Well, if that's true, then the people we're going to be looking at today must be amongst the biggest geniuses out there, because they're all prime examples of a wrestler taking a gimmick which worked for someone else in the past and
also, I'm curious as to what they mean by like stealing a gimmick, because there are people that have like stolen names, but not necessarily the persona. Like, would that be considered a stolen gimmick? Like, you have right here, Nature Boy Ric Flair. He's obviously a copy off of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers from way back in the day. I've never had a chance to like see Buddy Rogers or like what type of character he may play, because I think that might have even been before people like started doing like gimmicks and stuff. But him just having the name, does that qualify stolen gimmick? Even if he doesn't necessarily act like the person he's taking a gimmick from?
because they're all prime examples of a wrestler taking a gimmick which worked for someone else in the past and co-opting it as their own. Yes, sometimes theft really is the superior option, it seems. But what are the
Okay, first of all, let's go ahead and say,
yes,
clear this out of the way. Billy Graham is one of the most gimmick infringed wrestlers of all time. Like there's several wrestlers that like clearly stole his gimmick. When you talk about Hulk Hogan, when you talk about Jesse the Body Ventura, when you talk about Scott Steiner, like so many people have taken this man's gimmick. I think the only person that probably has had their gimmick stolen more would be, well, I would say Buddy Rogers, but I'll probably change that and say Ric Flair, because Buddy Rogers had the nickname, but Ric Flair was the one with the super long bleach blonde hair and the suits and the limousines and coming out in the robe and stuff like that. And when you think of all the wrestlers that like copied that same style with like the long blonde hair and the robes with the bedazzles and jewels and things like that. Like, so many people stole Ric Flair's gimmick.
Sometimes theft really is the superior option, it seems. But what are the best examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the time Vince McMahon stole the evil boss character from Eric Bischoff. That's right, while Mr. McMahon may have felt original to some WWF fans during the late 90s when, following the events of the Montreal Screwjob, he morphed into the megalomaniacal owner of the company who was obsessed with getting the world title off of Steve Austin, he wasn't actually the first person to portray such a gimmick. And that's because Eazy-E had him beat by a full 2 years,
oh boy,
as he'd turned heel himself when he joined the NWO in late 1996. With this marking the first incidence of the heel authority figure on a major modern wrestling show. Sure, you could argue that over time, Vince proved himself to be the more successful iteration of this character, as Mr. McMahon became arguably the most effective heel of his generation. Even today, in fact, he could be brought out on an episode of Raw or SmackDown, and he'd probably still get booed out of the building.
I just realized that the thing
Bischoff
was
wasn't
down.
great in the same role himself, as, with all his sleazy charms, it wasn't hard for him to get audiences to hate him.
That's actually, maybe, what if Eric Bischoff this entire time was just, portraying Vince behind closed doors? Because even before the sleazy shit that Vince eventually got called out for doing became public, I think that most people in the wrestling industry knew Vince McMahon to be a bit of an asshole and somebody that was like very focused on their money and was very cutthroat and ruthless. That was before he became Mr. McMahon. So maybe Eric Bischoff was just portraying Vince McMahon on camera. And real quick, Vince McMahon is easily the greatest heel of all time. I would agree to that. Like, when you think about like bad guys in wrestling, I think that nobody's had a bigger impact or influence than evil Vince McMahon. Do you really need to qualify Vince McMahon with evil? Mr. McMahon, the Mr. McMahon character, no one had a bigger impact. When you think about like wrestlers that after him have like went on to become like corrupt authority figures, he kind of created that trope. Like, I know they say it like Eric Bischoff was doing it before, but Vince McMahon was easily the influence of people like afterwards doing that whole evil boss gimmick.
Hell, had history worked out slightly differently and WCW won the Monday Night Wars, maybe
Wish
it
they
would be
wouldn't have.
him who was selling out to Endeavor for a multi-billion-dollar paycheck instead. Ultimately, though, things just didn't play out that way. And, however,
WCW was
since managed
doomed
to carve out a
the
nice
second they
career for
start
himself
giving
as a
out
television producer and
those
podcaster.
cushy
And
contracts
if
to
that
talent.
wasn't enough, no matter how successful Vince McMahon ultimately was in the role, Eric can always say he was the first to do it, something no one can ever take away from him. But then the exact same thing could be said about one of our next subjects.
You can't let the
PNU,
patients run the
as
asylum.
His early 90s rapping gimmick would later be stolen
think,
wholesale by none other than John Cena.
You can't let the patients run the asylum and then think you're going to be successful. It's just not going to happen. And as far as this, John Cena, it wasn't so much that John Cena had a rapping gimmick. To me, it was more like he had like a Vanilla Ice gimmick, where it was like, you got a white rapper that like portrays themselves as if they're like big black hip hop artists. That's how I always took it. Like, he was like a Vanilla Ice character. Now, it's possible this other dude is too, but when I look at him, I just think of like a dude like trying to like be hip hop. I guess it's kind of the same thing. He kind of reminds me of like Akeem the African Dream. Like someone that's like kind of delusional. Whereas John Cena took the gimmick a bit more serious.
Now, we're sure if you're watching this video, you're well aware of who John Cena is. After all, he's probably the biggest thing to happen to the wrestling industry since The Rock. And you also probably remember that, while his most famous incarnation was the hustle, loyalty, and respect preaching uber babyface, early on in his career, he actually played a far more heelish rapper. And this Doctor of Thugonomics gimmick was cribbed heavily from what Paul New was doing over in WCW between 1991 and 1992, as there, he'd be portraying the character of PN News, another rapping gimmick. Although in his case, his version would be one who was far more influenced by the lighter MTV rap of the time, and less the gangster style, which would serve as the basis for much of what his future imitator did. Yes, rather than sound like Ice Cube or Nas, PN News was far more child-friendly in his tone, a lot closer to Vanilla Ice in fact, and that was also shown in his colorful ring gear and easygoing manner whenever he hit the ring. Of course, this was where he and Big Match John would differ then, as Cena always portrayed a more thuggish rapper, perfectly in tone with his Doctor of Thugonomics moniker. And it was this which helped him to get over big time with the more anti-hero loving early 2000s crowd. So over did he get in fact he'd eventually have to be turned babyface, with this being a period which saw him drop the rapping entirely and instead transform into his more well-known smiling face of the company incarnation.
Yep. I feel like his later gimmick after he became a babyface was more like like almost like a soldier gimmick, like a Captain America type soldier or something. I was gonna say that, like, yeah, he had a bit more of a serious, like, I guess thuggish tone, but I don't know, I never really took it like too serious like that. Like, always, like, I don't know. I saw John Cena when he first came out, like with the Thugonomics gimmick and stuff, as kind of like a, like he didn't seem like a big time player to me. Like, I remember when the SmackDown Here Comes the Pain game came out, and when I first played that, and John Cena was like a playable character or whatever, and they treated him like a background character because he was one of them characters that like wasn't really modeled all that well. Whereas you have like the characters that were like The Rock and Brock Lesnar and Stone Cold and all them that had like more detailed models. Like that kind of fed into like my mindset of John Cena at the time, where it's just like, oh, he's okay, but he's not like anything to be taken serious. Like I remember one time watching a match between him and Brock Lesnar on TV, and I was thinking like, oh, Brock Lesnar's gonna like crush this dude, and he kind of did, I think. Like at that point, John Cena was still a bit of like a mid-carder. I wouldn't even say mid-carder, like he was slightly under mid-card. He didn't last there long, like he eventually like left that area like fairly fast, but at the time when I was watching, I remember thinking like really? Like who's John Cena? Like really?
But had it not been for the success he found during those early days dropping bars in the same way
of course he made a name for
himself
himself.
A decade before, he'd probably never have reached this point at all. And that means if you're a fan of PG era WWE, you should probably thank the early 90s WCW star for the inspiration.
There are fans of the PG era?
Just as you should also probably thank the world's greatest tag team if you're a fan of what NXT was doing with their tag team division in the mid-2010s, as they were a clear point of inspiration for American Alpha. But then this one goes way beyond inspiration and into the realms of complete theft.
I was about to say like, well, I mean, Chad Gable is part of American Alpha, so it still kind of carries on. But I was about to say like even recently with the Alpha Academy, it's like, yeah, that's a bit of the whole like team angle thing that they were doing back then. They should bring Kurt Angle in as a manager. Like correct that whole thing about what's his name, Jason Jordan being this guy, being Kurt Angle's son. They should have made it him, and they should like correct that by bringing Kurt Angle back on TV and making him like a manager.
As Chad Gable and Jason Jordan were so similar to their precursors in everything they did, it was almost as if they were the secret children of Shelton Benjamin and Charlie Haas. Hell, at one point, Jordan would actually be written to be the kayfabe child of Kurt Angle, the occasional third man in the world's greatest tag team mix. What made them so similar? Well, their in-ring styles for one, as with all four having some degree of amateur wrestling skills, they were able to translate this into a pro wrestling context perfectly. And this meant playing the role of a technically superior tag team who worked together as smoothly as butter, and who used their skills to overcome pretty much all their opponents with ease. Need any evidence of how great both teams were in the ring during their heydays? Well, how about the fact that they won 5 sets of tag team titles between them in places such as WWE, NXT, and Ring of Honor? And if you need any further evidence of their similarities in style, you only have to look at the fact that once Jason Jordan had to retire on account of a neck injury, Chad Gable would briefly find a new partner in the form of former World's Greatest Tag Team member, Shelton Benjamin. Honestly, it seems like the only thing we didn't get from these duos in the end was them coming together to form one big stable of technical wrestling excellence. But then maybe it's for the best this didn't happen. At least for the rest of the roster anyway, as had things played out in such a way, it's likely no one else would have been able to compete. And we probably could say the same thing for our next two teams we're about to look at as well, though in their cases, it would be less about technical skill and more about sheer brawling power. Because when the APA started their run as the hired muscle of the WWF roster at the turn of the millennium, what some didn't realize was that they were only doing what Chronic had previously done over in WCW. That's right. Well, it might have only been a few months.
Yep, see, I don't remember Chronic in him at all.
The duo of Brian Clark and Brian Adams. No, not that one. The other one.
Now, of course, the gimmick of APA is like they were muscles for hire, essentially. Before that, they were acolytes for The Undertaker and his group. So they were like, they had like a mystical like gimmick to them. But that changed around the time like the Attitude Era started to hit like the 2000s. They switched over to like businessmen that would like go out and beat people up when they like if you paid them or whatever. So I'm wondering like if these people have like a similar gimmick to that.
Done over in WCW. That's right. Well, it might have only been a few months in difference. Technically, the duo of Brian Clark and Brian Adams. No, not that one. The other one. Beat Bradshaw and Farouk to the punch when they first came up with the idea of selling their services as ass kickers to whoever would pay the highest price.
Yeah.
But how did it happen to them in the first place? Well, basically, it all goes back to the early days there in the spring of 2000 when, after switching between babyface and heel a few times, they decided they were tired of being tied down to any one alignment, and that instead, they would just fight whoever they'd been paid to on any given night. And that led to them soon developing the catchphrase of breaking necks and cashing checks. A mantra which served them well as they'd find a fair degree of success during the dying days.
That rope run was not the best.
But they wouldn't be the only ones living by such a mantra as it happened, because after seeing the money they were raking in, the Acolytes stole their idea and used it for themselves over in WWF, when they morphed into the Acolyte Protection Agency, New York's premier goons for hire company who didn't care if you were a good guy or a bad guy, only that the color of your money was green. The only shame about the whole thing then is that once Vince McMahon bought out WCW in early 2001 and brought a lot of their mid-card roster over to his own promotion, we never got to see the showdown between Chronic and the APA. And that was because, after a couple of truly terrible matches against the Brothers of Destruction, Brian Clark and Brian Adams would be fired outright, robbing fans of a chance to see who the best hired muscle on the roster really was. But then we kind of already know the answer to that question was the APA. Even if we didn't get to see the two sides fight it out, as they were the one with Ron Simmons on their side, one of the shoot toughest men in wrestling history. In fact, in the annals of WWE at least, there are probably only a handful of men who could have beaten him in a real fight, and one of these was one of our next subjects, Andre the Giant. But why is Andre a topic of discussion for us at this point? Well, that's because he would also have his gimmick stolen years down the line by none other than Paul White. Yes, before he was a commentator and occasional wrestler on AEW. Before he was WWE's four-time world champion The Big Show, in fact, Paul White was first making his name in WCW as The Giant.
I remember when Big Show first debuted.
Other than the fact that he was 7 foot tall, of course, was that he was being portrayed as the kayfabe son of Andre the Giant. Hell, this was pretty much the reason he got a job with the Southern Wrestling Company in the first place.
At the time, I legitimately thought he was like his son.
When Hogan spotted him at a basketball game, he'd be recommended to WCW boss Eric Bischoff. Why was the Hulkster so taken with the South Carolina native? Well, this was because, seeing in him a mirror of one of his greatest ever foes, he recognized an opportunity to relive the past by having the Hogan-Andre rematch that could never happen in reality anymore. That's right, after the Frenchman had died in 1993, any hopes of seeing the two lock it up again were over. But if Andre had a secret son no one knew about, one who was just as tall as him and dressed in a singlet just like him, then that would surely be the next best thing, right? So it was then that after debuting as the newest member of the Dungeon of Doom, the Giant made his intentions in WCW clear, with those intentions being to honor his fallen father by taking out his biggest enemy once and for all.
The problem with like Paul White's Giant characters is he kind of like he lost that attraction aspect. Like what made Andre so special was that, one, he rarely lost. He always made sure that, like, you know, like, if you're gonna have a giant, then they should be someone that is considered like an obstacle, not something that everybody beats. Like Paul White, he like had various points in his career where he became like was essentially like just a jobber or like talent enhancement. Like just he let everybody do like moves and stuff against him as like shows of strength and stuff. Like Brock Lesnar giving him an F5, John Cena giving him FU, attitude adjustment, whatever the hell. I always called it FU for the longest. Like Goldberg giving him a jackhammer. Like he essentially like made himself like the measuring stick for other wrestlers' like strength feats. And like once they do a strength feat, you can't beat them after that. Like they just did an impressive like maneuver. That's essentially the end. Like the match ain't gonna get bigger than that. So you have to end it right there, and he ends up on the losing end. So I feel like he should have protected his gimmick more, and I think that probably would have led to him having a much bigger impact legacy wise. But I mean, he's still a legend, but I just feel like he would be up there with Andre the Giant and stuff if he would have been more protective of his character.
Would this work out for him? Yes, as it happened, because on night one with the company, White would defeat Hogan to become WCW champion. Sure, this was only a brief run, as the very next night he'd be stripped of the belt on account of the screwy nature of the match's finish. But even this created similarities between him and his kayfabe dad. And that was because Andre had done a very similar thing years prior when he beat the Hulkster for the WWF title under suspect circumstances, then relinquished it mere minutes later when he sold it to the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. So in a way, the saga of Andre the Giant and Paul White is like a time loop which keeps repeating itself, with each mirroring the other's successes. It's just a shame the same couldn't be said for one of our next subjects then, as while Juventud Guerrera did find some measure of success in WCW's Cruiserweight division during the late 90s, even when he morphed into the Juice, he still wasn't able to match up to the level of The Rock.
Yeah, I was about to say, I heard that he had like a bit of a Rock gimmick at one point, but I never really I never really connected it. I mean, to be honest, I didn't really pay too much attention to Juventud Guerrero, but I never really thought about The Rock. Maybe I could be wrong. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention. Now, like a modern wrestler like Ricky Stark, or what's his name now, Ricky Saints, like he's a clear copy of The Rock. Like no hands, like bar, like not like 100%, almost a photocopy of The Rock as far as like gimmicks are concerned. You can see it like clear as day, which is funny because you would think they would adapt The Rock's gimmick, because I believe The Rock, his gimmick originally was like he was like essentially like a jock athlete, kind of like a Deion Sanders, like one of those flashy athletes. I think that was The Rock's original like gimmick. So like if you were to adopt that today, it would be more like a Floyd Mayweather, a Conor McGregor, something like that. Like that'd be more of like a modern version of like The Rock's character. But like to this day, people are still doing like what The Rock was doing in the 90s, which was what the flashy athletes were doing in the 90s with like the flat, like not flat tops, but like essentially flat top fades, the like Versace outfits, the gold chains and the Rolexes and the like the dress shoes and dress pants and stuff, like the track outfits. Like they're kind of like copying The Rock to a T. They're not modernizing and adapting the character.
He still wasn't able to match up to the level of The Rock. But then how could he ever be expected to do this? After all, by the turn of the millennium, Dwayne Johnson's pro wrestling persona was so over with fans on account of his superhuman levels of charisma, he'd pretty much become the biggest star in the entire industry. And that meant anyone who was trying to imitate him could only look second-rate by comparison, which was exactly the situation Juvi found himself in at this point. Not that the Mexico City native wasn't good in his own right, of course. No, his own version of the cocky, trash-talking wrestler who referred to himself in the third person was done well enough that it got him over with WCW fans, moreover than most cruiserweights.
I didn't see a promo of him because I've never seen him do it.
That said, it was always clear which one was the imitator here and which one was the original. and that Original could only ever be the guy carrying the main event scene in New York during 2000 in the wake of Steve Austin's neck injury. But even if he was more over and more charismatic in general, you could argue The Rock was never as good of a wrestler as Hoovy. And that's why it would have been so interesting to see them go one-on-one once the invasion angle began in mid-2001 then.
But I'll make the argument, though, in professional wrestling, character and presentation mean more than wrestling ability. I truly believe that. Like, if you have the personality down, if you have the look down, if you have the right music, if you have the right like presentation, you can get over a lot more than you would if you were a great wrestler. Matter of fact, I'd be willing to say that being a technical wrestler almost limits your ability to like reach the top of wrestling. Because like when you think of all like greatest like top guys in wrestling, usually they're not technical wrestlers. And even if they are like great wrestlers that have good presentations, they still don't get over as well as someone with a top tier presentation with less wrestling ability. Like look at Shawn Michaels, for example. Shawn Michaels to me is like the greatest in-ring wrestler of all time. And he had an amazing presentation. He had an amazing look. Like he essentially like looked like a top wrestler, which he was, but he never hit the same like level of popularity as like Stone Cold and The Rock and all them. I'm willing to bet that if Shawn Michaels was more of a brawler and wasn't as much of like a high flyer and an entertainer necessarily, I'm willing to bet that his career probably would have gotten a little bit further. Like that's my opinion. I think his career would have got a little bit further. Like someone that just like, because when you're a technical wrestler or somebody that takes like wrestling very seriously, it comes off almost like it takes some cool points away. Cause it's like you're focusing too much on like this thing. Whereas cool wrestlers or characters with like cool personalities, like they don't give a damn. They just go in there and they just kick ass. They're not thinking about like doing all the technical stuff and trying to like, no, they just get in there and they just start beating the hell out of you. Like The Rock wasn't a very like good technical wrestler. Stone Cold early in his career was a great technical or was a very good like in-ring wrestler and stuff like that. But later in his career, he just became a bit of a brawler. Now their psychology was still like great, but like he just became a brawler. And I think that that's what like benefits him. You just go in there, you just kick ass. You ain't thinking about doing these like super advanced like maneuvers and this, that, and that. No, you're just in there, you're just gonna kick ass. You're just gonna beat the hell out of the person, you're gonna stomp a mud hole in them, and then you're gonna pin them and call it a day. Like you don't have a super over the top finishing move. It's just something simple and quick. Stone Cold Stunner, bam. Rock Bottom, bam. The People's Elbow was more of a setup and theatrics than it was an actual move. So that's all about presentation. You look at like Hulk Hogan, leg drop, bam. John Cena has the AA, but I'd be willing to say that the AA is not as over as the Stone Cold Stunner or the Rock Bottom or those types of moves. But yeah, it's like, I think that the more simplified your wrestling style is, but you also have charisma and a presentation and things to go along with it, it will actually go further. Like it would help benefit your career further than it would if you didn't have that stuff. I think that's one of the things that kind of keeps LA Knight from like breaking that into that top guy tier. Like his presentation looks amazing, but then when he gets into the ring, to me, it looks no different than like The Miz or someone like that. Like it looks like the same as everybody else that's wrestling nowadays. Now I think that he should like simplify it, get a finishing move that's just like not as generic looking as the BFT, and you know, like just go in there and just whoop ass. I think he'd get over better.
It's been so interesting to see them go one-on-one once the invasion angle began in mid-2001 then. Unfortunately though, such a bout would never occur because Guerrero's contract wasn't picked up as part of the WCW buyout, and by the time he finally did join the WWE roster in 2005, The Rock would have gone to Hollywood full-time. So we can only imagine what might have happened had the pair locked horns then. Would Hoovy have proven the Juice truly was superior to the
No.
Great One?
No.
It's impossible to say. But one thing
It
we
isn't.
can say for sure is that one of
It
our
isn't.
next subjects can officially say he's better.
I'm sorry, it isn't. The Rock would have like done the same thing to Juventud Guerrera that he did to everybody else when he came back and did his cameos and all. He would have went in there. He would have cut a promo on him. The other person would have tried to like, because we're talking about like prime Rock. Nowadays, I think that The Rock is more so like Dwayne Johnson doing a Rock gimmick. Like he's Dwayne Johnson doing a Rock impression. That's what it comes off to me. The modern Rock. He doesn't have that same old school Rock feel to him. We're talking prime Rock. Prime Rock would have destroyed Juventud Guerrera. He would have cut a promo on him so scathing that it probably would have actually like hurt any type of push or whatever he had at the time. And The Rock would have just like beat him easy. I don't think they would have did a big program or anything like that. It would have been, Rock would have embarrassed him. And no disrespect to Juventud Guerrera, but I'm just saying based off of like the way The Rock's like interactions was going on around that time. Rock would have come out, he would have cut a promo that like embarrassed him essentially. He'd have like went in there with his punches, boom. And then he like Juventud probably would have got a little bit of offense until The Rock eventually like reversed it, hit him with the spine buster, or hit him with a Stone Cold Stunner, not Stone Cold Stunner, hit him with a rock bottom, and then like would have went straight into the people's elbow, pin him 1, 2, 3. Ref raises his hand. If you smell, did you do what the? I don't even know if the ref raises his hand. I think he just goes straight to the turnbuckle and just. You smell what The Rock is cooking. Doom, 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 and then he just like walks out and leaves Juventud in the middle of the ring. That's what I think.
Say. But one thing we can say for sure is that one of our next subjects can officially say he's better than his precursor in the sense he's been a world champion. Who are we talking about here? Why, Brodus Clay, and the man who inspired him, Flash Funk, of course. That's right, in November of 2022, the former Brodus Clay, now going by the name of Tyrus, would win the NWA World Heavyweight title.
That's
that
not
said, for most people, this...
No disrespect to the current NWA or anything. That's not saying much. That's not. Flash Funk gimmick, sure. I was thinking of like also a little bit of Ernest the Cat Miller. I think they all had like the same like theme song. Like somebody call my mama. I think they all had that same gimmick. Yeah, personally, I'm going with Ernest the Cat Miller over like all of. Don't get me wrong, like Too Cold Scorpio was a beast also. Like I love watching him wrestle, but I'm going with my man Ernest the Cat Miller.
Wouldn't be his most.
He brought in James Brown. That beats NWA Championship
of WWE back in 2012. As it was there, he played the dancing big man character of the Funkasaurus. Of course, for as much as he might have felt like he was breaking new ground here, though, Clay wasn't the first wrestler in New York to dance his way down to the ring with a funk soundtrack backing him. And that's because in the 90s, a certain Too Cold Scorpio was doing the same thing. Not that he'd be called Too Cold Scorpio at this point, however. No, in keeping with his new gimmick, he'd be transformed by Vince McMahon into Flash Funk, a man who looked like a character ripped straight out of the 70s. And it was with this look and with his Funkettes by his side then that he'd groove his way out through the curtain every night, exactly the same way as Brodus Clay would do years later with his Funkadactyls.
Except the difference is
apparently another example
Flash
of
Funk could dance.
A flat circle,
Brodus Clay couldn't.
Pretty much have the exact same act. Really, in some ways, you could have been forgiven for thinking the two were brothers, so similar were they in their gimmicks. And the reason you'd be forgiven for thinking this is because a sibling stealing his brother's gimmick had already happened prior. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but the Road Dogg and his ripoff, Buzzkill. Now, we can already hear you asking the question, who the hell was Buzzkill?
Yeah, I don't know who the hell
Buzzkill is. The answer to that
was
he was Brad Armstrong, son of the legendary Bullet Bob, and more importantly for the purposes of this video, brother to Brian Armstrong, the man better known to most fans as Road Dogg Jesse James. But despite having a fairly successful career of his own as a journeyman performer in the likes of WCW, USWA, and Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Brad was never able to match the success his younger sibling had when he struck gold during the Attitude Era with the New Age Outlaws. So maybe that was why, after seeing what he was doing during his team up with Billy Gunn there, the older Armstrong decided to take the Road Dogg gimmick for his own, with his version becoming known as Buzzkill. Sure, it wasn't exactly the kind of moniker.
First of all, the second they gave you the goddamn name Buzzkill, you should have known that was a dead gimmick from jump. Like, they call you Buzzkill. Ain't shit. Like, Jesse, like, Road Dogg he was cool. He had that cool, like, style to him. He'd come out and, like, shoot that promo before his intro or whatever. Like, that was awesome. I would say, as a matter of fact, you could probably throw Enzo Amore in there too. I think he had Road Dogg Jesse James gimmick also. A little bit more like it was a bit more adapted to a somewhat more modern audience because it also had that like Jersey Shore thing going for it. But there was absolutely influence with Road Dogg with him. But like, yeah, like Roadkill, you come out wearing a tie-dye shirt and like looks like fucking dreadlocks or some shit. Like, you look like a damn like weed character or some shit, like a stereotypical stoner. Like a stereotypical stoner at that time. But it's like, yeah, there's no way you should have been able to look at that and be like, oh, this is fire.
His own, with
maybe he did.
Maybe
somebody just put it on.
Sure, it wasn't exactly the kind of moniker that made you want to watch him, and neither was the budget tie-dyed shirt he wore down to the ring. But it was an attempt
He's a
at doing
hipster.
something to get himself over.
A hipster,
and
a hippie.
You can't exactly blame him for that.
They made him a
Still,
hippie.
For the reasons we just mentioned, fans never really took to this one, as they pretty quickly saw it for what it was.
No
a
shit.
cheap imitation. Would it have helped if most people watching were aware that Buzzkill and Road Dogg were shoot brothers?
I mean, he's a
Sure,
hippie.
But that wasn't really put across at the time, probably because this was
For a wrestling audience, a hippie gimmick is not going to get over. It's not. That's like, that would be like pushing out the Right to Censor faction and expecting them to get cheered. Like, it's not going to work.
Shoot brothers? Sure, but that wasn't really put across at the time, probably because this was when Vince Russo was running the show down south. So maybe it's for the best this one just quietly faded into obscurity once Brad picked up an injury in 2000 then, with that marking the last time he'd be seen in WCW before the company was bought out by Vince McMahon a year later and merged with WWF. But not all stolen gimmicks end up flopping this hard. No, some arguably turn out to be more successful than the original. And we can say this with some degree of confidence because we still remember the time LayCool got over big time in early 2010's WWE by doing their own take on TNA's The Beautiful People. Yes, despite the perception usually being that Impact are a less
I don't know a
prominent
damn
company,
thing about
there
TNA
have
during
been
this
a few
time.
notable occasions when they've come up with something so good, other bigger promotions have been falling over themselves to copy it. Just look at Broken Matt Hardy if you don't believe us.
Like, I kind of stepped away from wrestling by this point in like the later years of the PG era and stuff. I didn't come back until around, like, I would say like 2011 or something with CM Punk and stuff. But I never jumped into TNA. Like, TNA was like toxic going back to like 2008 or whatever when Hulk Hogan and them like came in. And like, I just kind of like turned away and never looked back on as far as like they were concerned.
And if you need another example of this, just look towards the stable, which was at various points made up of Angelina Love, Velvet Sky, Madison Rayne, Lacey Von Erich, and Cute Kip. Why are they such a good example? Well, because with their aesthetic ripped straight out of the Lindsay Lohan movie Mean Girls, they served as a template for what Layla and Michelle McCool would do over in WWE just a couple of years later. Sure, LayCool would differ slightly in that there were only two of them, and they didn't have Billy Gunn in the post-Mr. Ass, pre-Daddy Ass phase of his career as part of their stable. But aside from that, the similarities were striking. Need someone who could act as the vain bullies of the women's division by taking cheap shots at the babyface roster? Then both The Beautiful People and LayCool were a perfect choice depending on which company you were a fan of at the time. And
I think LayCool would have like worked really well with what was it called? The reality show that had Nicole Richie and Paris Hilton. Like, I think they would be able to pull like that. Maybe they did do it a little bit, but like, I look at them and I'm like, oh, that would have been perfect for like if they would have like made a gimmick of that whole situation, because this was around the time when like that show was still relevant. So I think it could have worked.
And Lay Cool were a perfect choice depending on which company you were a fan of at the time. And it wasn't like they were all talk either. No, both sides could handle themselves when the time came for the bell to ring too, which was exactly why the former would win 6 world titles and 2 sets of tag team titles between them, all while the latter were winning an almost as impressive 4 world titles and 2 Slammy Awards. Unfortunately though, the mean girl bullying tactics of the characters involved came back to bite them in the end, as before 2011 was over, both stables would have imploded in a fog of infighting. That said, at least on the beautiful people side of the equation, they'd get to briefly reunite a few years later when in 2016, Love, Sky, and Rain all came together once more. As for Lay Cool though, well, they'd never have such a reunion, because Michelle McCool would retire before this was possible. Still, maybe it's a good thing that happened, as sometimes things are best left in the past during a time period when they were still at their peak. And we could certainly say the same thing about 2 of our next subjects as well, the Godwins, because were they to come around today with their knockoff Hillbilly Jim gimmick, it might not have the same levels of success. Back in the mid-90s, however, the time period where every wrestler in WWF had to have a side gig.
Would it really be stealing a gimmick though if the person that you're stealing the gimmick from is like involved in it? Like, I don't know. I don't know if I would consider that to be a stolen gimmick necessarily. It's like, that's almost like an endorsement. Like if I was thinking like a stolen gimmick, I would think of maybe, like if this qualifies, then you can probably throw in like the, when, Bart Gunn and who was it? Bart Gunn and was it Bradshaw? They're like the Blackjack twins or whatever the hell they were called. And they were doing like a Blackjack Mulligan gimmick or whatever. Like you could throw that in there. Trying to think of other characters that were like endorsed. Now, would you call Dominic Mysterio's babyface run to be a gimmick stealing of Rey Mysterio? Like, yeah, it would. I don't know. I wouldn't really consider that to be stealing.
They fit in perfectly as a pair of hog farmers moonlighting as a top tag team. That said, they should have known it would work because it wasn't like this was the first time such characters had been tried out in New York. No, a full decade between Henry O and Phineas I began plying their craft under Vince McMahon's employ.
I just realized that was Midian.
Doing the same thing with a character which could have easily served as their father, and if not that, then at least an older brother. Hell, this is probably why he was brought in to manage the Godwins at one point, as the similarities between the 3 were so striking, it wouldn't have made any sense for anyone else to fill the role. After all, they each shared the same dress sense, with that being a whole lot of denim overalls, and they also all had a particular liking for buckets of swill and hard-hitting in-ring styles. Really, if Hillbilly Jim had first come around a decade later when he was still an active competitor then, he'd probably have ended up as a full-blown tag team partner of Henry and Phineas. As it stood though, he'd instead watch proudly from the sidelines as the gimmick he helped to create was able to carry over into a new generation and find just as much success as it had initially.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. Yeah, there's so many different like gimmicks and stuff that it's kind of iffy. I don't know if I would consider some of these to be like what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know if I would consider some of these to be stolen. Like I said, if someone endorses you, then it's not stealing as far as I'm concerned. It's like passing the gimmick on. But yeah, you have like, was it Shark Boy in TNA for a minute? He was doing like a Stone Cold gimmick. You could probably say, would you say that Crime Time was like taking the gimmick of the Gangsters? Would that be a good comparison to make? Maybe. I think the Dudleys might have also been a little bit of the Gangsters, maybe. Yeah, I'll be sitting here thinking about this for a very long time, but yeah, if you guys like this video, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. If you happen to be a wrestling fan, go in the comment section. Let me know what your opinions are in regards to this. If you have any videos that you recommend me watch in wrestling, feel free to leave those recommendations. You can leave them in the chat or the comment section. Just make sure you put like a hashtag DaVinci Reacts in the comment. That way I can like filter it when I go look through like requests. But the best way to get a reaction from me is to recommend a video on the Discord. The Discord is in the description box down below. Join the Discord and leave a link to the video in the video requests channel on the Discord, and I'll be able to look at it there, and I'll be able to react to it like immediately. Anyway, I'm gonna give you guys the deuces. Be sure to check out this channel, which is, I didn't even mention it, it's a channel called Burn It Down 2.0. So I will have a link for their channel at the end of the video that'll pop up over here somewhere. The last 30 seconds you'll be able to see it, and also be sure to check out the original video again. Anyway, give you the deuces, and I'm signing out. Peace.